Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, and as well as to have Eric and Miriam on the panel as well. So I think it's clear to say that this whole return to work discussion and a post-pandemic workplace is the ultimate in-the-moment discussion. And I'm sure all of you are thinking about or may have already addressed return to work process and policy in some way, or as the survey data shows in a second, some of you are sticking with remote as your preferred operating approach. But it's clear that either way, the ongoing challenge and opportunities to run your business differently in the context of how and where work gets done while scaling revenue, culture, and maintaining a safe workplace really offers a true laboratory of learning that extends beyond this one session, to be honest. Plus, each workplace is unique, and that's going to require a unique way of solution. Just to give you one example before we go into the data, in my current world of sports, the workplace extends to 14 additional work sites in addition to our two primary campus work locations, one in New Jersey and one being built in North Carolina. And those work sites are sites that are locations for major events. And the dynamics of those work sites in the current and post-pandemic environment involve fans and employees and those in the competitions and volunteers and broadcast and vendors and partners and municipalities. And there's this complexity that already existed that has now been even multiple X more complicated. And so part of the challenges of both our version of the real estate, both physical and outside, to also questions around vaccination are things that are really transcendent. And ultimately, that's what we're going to talk about today, which is the impact on real estate and the role of vaccinations in the workplace and what that means for everyone here. If you take a look at the slide that was just put up, and this was, again, part of what we had asked originally ahead of the session, you'll see, and I think a great takeaway right off the top is that early last year, when the pandemic began, 54% of you were operating full-time in the office and 39% worked remotely as needed. And as you evolve going forward, 70 up to 3/4 of you will adopt a fully remote or hybrid model in a way that kind of redefines work, workforce, and workplace. And ultimately, this is going to be a huge question for everyone to solve for, particularly as your businesses grow. And there are a number of factors. One, right off the top, is the fact that how you are sourcing and recruiting talent and where talent is suddenly becomes a national opportunity in a way that maybe if you are fully remote, also suggests that your own people are also opportunities to be poached as much as it is you're looking for people to join the organization. And as well, some of your thoughts on vaccine requirements and ultimately the workplace of the future from a real estate point of view. So this is going to be something that requires very individualized solutions for each organization involved. So with that, let's jump in right into the core of the discussion. And Eric and Miriam are experts for the purpose of helping offer some very fact-based and evidence-based information that will help in your decision-making going forward. So Eric, let's start with a simple question around what you're seeing in the state of real estate and workplace today, and what trends you might be seeing in terms of office redesign or reusage as we look to the post-pandemic workplace.
Steve, thank you very much for having me today. Greetings to all the Edison team and portfolio companies. So, it's been a remarkable year. We started out, approximately a year ago wondering, wow, can we work remotely? Realizing, oh my God, we can. And, in many cases, productivity was actually improved. And as the year went on, many of the discussions I've had on forums like this are, okay, I'm tired of talking. I'm zoomed out. I have enough 2-inch boxes on my screen, and it's hard for me to pay attention for 5 to 8 hours a day on Zoom. It would be great to have some human interaction. So a number of companies have come back during the pandemic, and they've made concessions, or they, in order to do that, they've gone to staggered seating. They've put up plastic or plexiglass barriers in their office. They've gone to a blue team, white team kind of format, where it's, blue team this week, white team next week. And they've just kind of tried to manage their way through the pandemic. What we're seeing now is we're planning with a number of our clients, looking forward as we can hopefully see the end of the shutdown or the pandemic here, is that there are two major points that are emerging out of this. The first one is what we're calling a hub and spoke model, where many companies are reducing their footprint in what was their headquarters location, and then creating spokes in the suburbs, and that could be a smaller office in the suburbs. It could even be a WeWork or a Regus out in the suburbs, or it could be renting a hotel room, a hotel conference room for weekly meetings, just to maintain some degree of camaraderie and contact. The other thing we're seeing is that work from home is part of our future, and 20 to 30% of the people are going to work from home. And so companies now planning to come back to the office or reinvent their office space have to create a template for 70 to 80% of their people to work 2 to 4 days a week in the office, and figure out a way to make that all efficient. And everybody wants to work in the office Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and have Monday and Friday off. So,
Right.
so there are all kinds of challenges that you see, but those are the two big changes that we're seeing from how companies are looking at their workforce. And obviously, from a layout standpoint, there's going to be less bench seating, which was, especially in the cities, was absolutely the rage. There are going to be more workstations. There are going to be more open collaborative areas, more meeting rooms, and a number of private offices. And then what we're also seeing is that companies are, as they're negotiating these new leases, are wiring and planning for the future, for when they can become more densely populated, but they're not necessarily incurring the furniture cost today. So the two big changes going forward are really a hub and spoke kind of model, and then planning on a 70 to 80% workforce that's within the office, and to accommodate the platoon or the work from home contingent.
Right. Yeah. Listen, I mean, it's very clear that productivity is one element of the question around how is the organization performing today versus tomorrow. I mean, literally, as we speak, we are looking at a team optimization process and asking each team, based upon how they operate, recognizing organizations are often just collections of teams, to assess what they're going to need going forward in a hybrid setting, and using 4 criteria, which is connection, productivity, and well-being, and ultimately how those all are going to translate into the next phase of reopening. And I recognize that one of the questions asked is pertaining to productivity is working remote probably does help small groups perform, because it's a fast and kind of nimble approach to operating. But there's no question that larger task opportunities around strategy and prioritization, decision making has been affected, could be improved when people are together, but that remains to be seen in terms of a hybrid work environment, how that can be improved, because you're going to have people in multiple locations continuously anyway. So I think we're all going to be tested as leaders. But
yeah,
all of that, go ahead, Eric.
I think you're dead on, and I think one of the main things that I hear repeatedly as we've evolved through this from the panacea of, oh my God, we can work remotely and get rid of our office space, has become, while I can recruit nationally now, what made my company special was the mentoring and the learning from being in the room. And those organizations that are in the learn by being in the room are really affected more by not being together. And so that's one of the major the major impetus for getting everybody back, even on a part-time basis, because you don't need to be in 5 days a week, but you need to have that connectivity. I mean, when you're just walking down the hall, bumping into somebody, that's when the magic happens. Or just saying, oh, Steve, I meant to ask you, or Miriam, you know, I'm so glad I saw you because you just reminded me that this happened, and that doesn't happen on Zoom. The other thing that I hear is from leaders is that when you have 20 people on a screenshot, it's hard to single somebody out and say, hey, you screwed this up, or you did that, or whatever, and we need to, and I really want to get in your face and talk to you. And it's more difficult for leaders to be as effective as they need to be.
Right. Well, I think also, and let's bring Miriam into the conversation, since we're now at a place where vaccinations are going to become more ubiquitous, and we're going to see an increased number of organizations potentially start opening sooner versus later, as opposed to maybe some of the talk track 9 months ago. There are a lot of things for everyone here to consider, and I think Miriam being here is really important. So, Miriam, based upon everything that we're talking about here, so much of these decisions and actions come with an understanding around the legal and policy implications around vaccinations. So let's start with a common question that I suspect everybody wants to know the answer to, which is, can you speak about, can my company require vaccines as a requirement for employment or as a matter of practice? And if I work from home, or as a requirement to access the office or campus? Provide some clarity there. And are there any recommendations or accommodations under the law that we also need to be aware of?
Sure. So the short answer is, and you're right, this is what every client wants to know, is can we have a mandatory vaccine program? Short answer is yes, you can have a mandatory vaccine program, but there are a couple of caveats there. And that's because having a mandatory vaccine program will obviously implicate several federal and state employment laws. Particularly the Americans with Disabilities Act, religious accommodations under Title VII, and the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. So yes, although the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which is the agency that enforces federal employment discrimination laws, has issued guidance saying, yes, you can implement these mandatory vaccine programs. You'll also have to provide accommodations for those employees that cannot get a vaccine due to either a disability, pregnancy, or any sincerely held religious beliefs. So any employer who's going to decide to implement a mandatory vaccine program also has to be prepared that they're probably going to have to implement several reasonable accommodations for employees who cannot get the vaccine.
Mm-hmm. Are you hearing from your clients as to some of their issues and challenges around what you just said? What kind of questions are you getting from them that might be helpful to this group?
Sure. I'm getting questions, several questions. One question is, how do we, if we have some employees who can work remotely and some employees that have to be on site, how do we implement this mandatory vaccine program? Can we just require it for people who are on site and allow people who are full-time remote workers to, opt out of the vaccine? That's a question that I've gotten a lot, particularly, as Eric said, there's certainly a movement towards remote working. And I don't think anything's going to go back, to 100% normal, to, how we were working prior to the start of COVID. So that's a question that gets asked a lot. And the answer there is yes, you can have a vaccine program that only the vaccines are only required for individuals who are going to be on site or traveling for work or going to company meetings. However, you have to be careful that does not adversely impact or negatively impact some populations. For example, those populations that can't work remotely and actually have to be, sometimes lower income individuals who cannot work remotely and have to be commuting into the office. So that'll certainly be an individualized assessment. But from just a broader perspective standard, yes, you can have a program that only requires a vaccine for on-site work.
So go ahead,
can I
Eric.
Jump in and ask a two-part question? What incentives are legitimate incentives for an employer to give to employees? Because I've heard some CEOs are saying, I'm not sure if I can force somebody, but what kind of incentives can I do it? And then if somebody doesn't want the vaccine, how do you manage the working environment with somebody who has the vaccine and somebody who doesn't have the vaccine?
Sure. So I'll do the incentive portion first. So yes, you technically can give incentives, but the EEOC has guided that those incentives should not be too large. So we've seen some employers, certainly you can pay the employee for time off that they take to get the vaccine. You can give the employee paid time off to the extent that they have any adverse reactions to the vaccine and need a few days to recover from those adverse reactions. And, we've seen some employers, I believe, Love's Travel Shops, and I think it was Marriott that recently implemented an incentive program, and it's, $100 gift cards to each employee who gets a vaccine. But the EEOC has cautioned that the incentives should not be too large because there are going to be individuals, let's say, who have a disability or who cannot receive a vaccine for sincerely held religious beliefs that won't be, entitled to that incentive. So you have to be careful about how you implement those programs as well.
Yeah, one of the things that, just to take a side note here on the dialogue that's happening in chat, one of the threads of conversation is the impact of remote and into hybrid around both, career and connection and productivity. That's an ongoing question for all of us. And admittedly, I think one of the key elements for organizations, particularly as you move towards more hybrid in a more firm sort of way, will be reasserting culture and behavior and values in a way that you might have done pre-COVID, but might take on a new resonance because it really is going to show itself in a way that is either prepared for the next stage or needing to be reassessed for the next stage. And so this is something I think that really is going to essentially call out the quality of leadership even more so than we've had to deal with in a remote workspace. Now operating in probably a more we were in a remote. So if anything, I see the possibility that this session might also beget other sessions that might be worthwhile as we all kind of experience this journey together. Eric, let me go back. Has been brought up, and you touched upon this, but when you think about the notion of a hybrid workplace or some kind of platoon setup, as a leaseholder and some of the conversations around leaseholding, talk about things you need to think about, whether it's to use less space, to change the space setup, or if you decide to relinquish the need for space. What are some of the things that folks should be considering and looking at to the future?
Well, the first thing that you need to do is look at your lease. I mean, most people are beholden to what the lease says. So the first thing that we always do is we come and review the lease and evaluate what the options are. The next thing we do is come in with an architect and figure out what the work environment's going to look like going forward. So, obviously you can give up space through subleasing. We've actually even been successful negotiating with landlords to buy out of some or all of our clients' office space. But going forward, some of the clauses in the lease that used to be just throwaway clauses, specifically force majeure. I didn't even know how to spell force majeure 12 months ago, and now it's the one of the most important clauses in a lease. and because it was not pandemics were in many cases actually excluded in the force majeure clauses. So now it's very much part of the lease, part of the negotiation. So moving forward, trying to figure out what to do going forward, it really is dependent upon the culture of your organization and how you want it to look. Because it's an incredible time to be a tenant, especially if you're in an urban or city environment. Landlords are reeling right now. So if you have credit and you want to reevaluate your lease, this is the A+ time of the last 25, 30 years to be doing that.
But as you look at some of the larger tech companies, not everybody's Google, Facebook, and so on, buying more real estate, to Mehdi's point in the chat, that we need to embrace a different set of rules around space, which I completely agree. What needs to change from your vantage point? The environment is not the same. People need to look at their assets differently, people and fixed. Any thoughts on where this should head? I mean, do you have a point of view on that?
Yeah, I mean, as I said earlier, companies are going to be designing for this, 70 to 80% attendance, rotating attendance clause, and how you want your organization to look, there are just different ways to lay out the space and to make you as effective as possible. And that's really it's such an individual, a company specific question, in that we sit down and we go through a series of questions as far as how you want people to interact, where the interaction should happen, who should be there, and create an environment that is most productive and specific to your organization. So I wish I had a one size fits all, but it's really, now you're getting into getting very granular, and it is very company specific.
So Miriam, in the context of hybrid work environments, we're now going to be in a place where you're going to have other tensions that are going to occur. I mean, I'm experiencing it. I know everyone here in some way has experienced it, if not having made a choice or is about to deal with it, which is things like, testing and tracing, which were already in place as companies started to bring people back into the offices already last year, to mask wearing in the workplace, to social distancing, to entry protocols and temperature checks, or the use of apps to track staff accordingly. I mean, we used an app on a test basis that if I came closer to you at 6 feet, the app would cause a vibration and automatically set a tracing mechanism in place, because potentially if you were positive, at least I knew that I came closer to you. And so a lot of HIPAA issues around the reality of health data, as you referenced. Any advice or counsel to anybody here around the application of policies and thinking about this hybrid environment, just things to be aware of, any tips or questions that people should be thinking about as they begin to look at reopening the workplace?
Sure. I mean, I would start this by saying that, yes, the vaccine rollout, there are certainly a number of employees who've been vaccinated, and that is obviously going to increase. And so employees will probably feel a bit safer going to the workplace. But both OSHA and the CDC have issued guidance to say that regardless of whether you have vaccinated employees in the workplace, at least for the time being, we need to be really careful about continuing to implement the policies that we implemented back in April of last year when companies started thinking about reopening their workforce. So I don't think now is the time to do away with mask mandates and social distancing and temperature checks. I think it should be the sense that we get from both the CDC and OSHA is that things should be a bit status quo for now until the vaccine rollout progresses a bit more. And I think we're going to see the mask wearing and the social distancing and the lack of meetings and remote working going on for a long time, regardless of how many individuals are vaccinated. I think that some employers are scared, some employees are scared. So I think at the beginning, the appetite for kind of reopening is not going to be, everyone is kind of going to be on edge, if you will. There are some states that are, obviously rolling back their mask mandates and kind of reopening, but like I said, the CDC and OSHA have issued guidance to employers that they should continue to implement the safety measures that were considered in April and May of last year.
Yeah, the mask wearing obviously in the workplace is a touch point for lots of organizations. In some ways, it serves as a moment where people are either comfortable or uncomfortable to be in the workplace because of maybe some people are biased against wearing masks and they want others to follow the belief, and there are others who are not comfortable with that. And that's just a reality that I think extends to many organizations. And if you're in an office, why do I need to wear a mask? But those who work in open spaces, I have to wear a mask. There are so many conflicts that I think we're about to see grow exponentially. We're all going to have to figure this out together. One of the other things is a great question, Miriam, which is about travel and liability related to employee exposure. Any thoughts on travel and impact on the organization?
So back in April and May, when we were kind of advising clients on what to do when people were kind of softly reopening, and in terms of travel, is we're kind of letting employees decide whether they wanted to travel and make that decision, whether they wanted to travel for work or not. Now that we're seeing, vaccinations and just airports opening up, I think work travel is going to pick up. I think as of right now, most employers are probably going to ease into that and let employees decide, whether they want to travel, unless, of course, it's an essential function of their job. In terms of liability, the only really liability, I guess, if you want to call it that, in terms of travel is, sure, I guess if, you have an employee who's traveling for work and is exposed to COVID and gets really sick, they could certainly probably bring a workers' compensation claim, but that would be state law specific. In terms of liability, that's where the exposure liability.
There was a follow-up question around vaccinations to get into the office. Is there a case to be made when being in office is not mandatory? Any thoughts on that? The question was, is there legal consensus on whether requiring a vaccination to get into the office is legal in a case where being in the office is not mandatory?
Okay. So this EEOC hasn't gotten that, and that's really where we're taking this information from, at least as of now, because really no courts have had the opportunity to kind of take the EEOC guidance and opine on that. So the EEOC has not issued any specific guidance as to whether, if you have a policy if it's a policy across the board, even for those employees who are not going into the office and you're requiring mandatory vaccinations. So there's no kind of legal framework, at least as of yet, on that. I expect that we will see further guidance from the EEOC, especially as the vaccine rollout continues. But as of now, the EEOC is saying that you can implement a mandatory program for all employees, as long as you're allowing those reasonable accommodations for individuals that can't get the vaccine.
Excellent, thank you. Jean-Marc, you raised a great question, which is the question around culture and needing to the extent that there are stronger cultures who can navigate this experience. Clearly, some organizations probably are going to adapt better than others. And I think one of the things to recognize here is moving into a hybrid environment is different than operating a flexible workspace pre-COVID, because there were so many other elements that are not on the table today. And I do think for a number of organizations, hybrid could end up evolving into the flexible that people always wanted, but we've had to go through this journey to get there because of this unintended event known as a pandemic. And I think the culture test for organizations right now is going to be driven around communication. It's going to be driven around the leadership ability to manage hybrid productivity and collaboration, but also keeping in mind that well-being is a topic that just doesn't disappear when the hybrid workplace gets reset and becomes normalized, because well-being is still an issue that is about to become more complex, because now there could be, as some of the chat raises, is the sense of belonging. You know, to what degree do people feel the need and response to be in the office when they don't want to be, or feel that if they're not going to be there, that might affect their career progression as well. So I think we're getting a new set of challenges that are related to this new hybrid environment, to say the least.
I completely just want to jump in on a couple of things.
Please, Eric, go ahead.
And totally agree with what you were just saying and what John Mark was saying, is that, you know, what makes your company special as you're growing, as all the portfolio companies here are in that same arc of growth, is the leadership from the C-level people. And it's hard. You know, I've spoken to many of the people on this call who have said, you know, one of the hard things to do is maintain that culture. You know, what makes my company special is the effect that I have on my people. And if everybody's working remotely, a competitor can call and say, hey, you know, you're doing, you know, coding, you know, in your living room. I'll give you, you know, $10 an hour more. Come work for me. Okay. You know, there's nothing holding me there. So I think, one, the culture, you know, maintaining culture is absolutely essential to office space. And then the other thing is selling. If you need to see somebody, boy, you can't read the room on Zoom. I don't see anybody. All I see Steve and Miriam, and I don't see anybody else here. And there's no way for me to know, you know, how many people have muted me, which is not an unusual thing, but to be in the room and to see somebody and to be able to read them and connect with them is such an essential part of business. I mean, you know, you had the whole last panel was about, you know, effective leadership. I mean, leadership is all about, you know, reading your people and getting the most out of them. It's so hard to do on a video call. You need that connection.
Although I will say that the frame, just as the framework, the question was raised about, you know, rewriting the rules around real estate. I think there's a rewriting of the rules around effective leadership in a hybrid environment may require a different, some behavior change for people, just to kind of get over and acknowledge that things are changing around them as well. So I think we're kind of all in this space of trying to get grounded in a changing environment. Miriam, a question was raised in the chat. Is there liability to a company if an employee gets COVID and gives to a family member that gets sick? Can you respond to that one?
In terms of liability with respect to the family member, no, there wouldn't be liability there. Certainly if the employee has to then take care of that family member, that could trigger some kind of FMLA, Family Medical Leave Act requirement, or paid sick leave for that employee to take care of their family member that is sick. But the workers' compensation laws wouldn't extend to the employee's family member.
There was additional follow-up on state laws and their impact on companies. I know you're sitting in Illinois in the Chicago area, but any thought on state law impact on this discussion?
Well, I mean, in terms of, there are some state laws that are certainly going to come into play. So all states have an anti-discrimination law, disability laws, pregnancy laws. Most states have a specific pregnancy laws. So when we're talking about what I was speaking about at the beginning about how, the EEOC is allowing mandated vaccines with the caveat that, you have to provide those reasonable accommodations, state laws will also come into play. Fortunately, most of those state laws follow federal law, so it's rare that you're going to have to be looking at both laws. Once you're on notice that you have an employee with a disability who can't get the vaccine, the next steps are going to be the same under both laws. There are some state laws, though, that, it's important to look at your state laws. A couple of states protect against political affiliation discrimination. So while that's not a federal law, you might see that at the state law level, which could clearly hugely come into play here because, there's a lot of, political arguments around the vaccine, around masks, mask usage, and related safety precautions. And so, in some states, I believe New York, and then DC, there is, a requirement that employers cannot discriminate based on political affiliation. So it's possible that an employee could say, that their political belief prevents them from getting the vaccine, and therefore the employer is discriminating against them if they don't agree to the vaccine. We haven't seen that, at least I haven't seen that play out yet because this is so early. I'm sure that we will see it play out in the courts. But that's an area. And then there are some states that have, in very early legislation, nothing passed yet, that are considering actually enacting laws to prevent discrimination against those individuals who have not been vaccinated. I'm not sure how far those laws will go, but I believe Rhode Island is one state that comes to mind that, has at least proposed regulations in place to prevent discrimination against those who elect not to get vaccinated. But like I said, I think that's pretty early on in the works.
And certainly, even speaking in today's news, I saw that I guess Pfizer and BioNTech commented that the dosage has a 6-month efficacy, or at least that's what they know today. And I'm assuming that suggests a booster is part of the process, and I guess becomes a seasonal opportunity, and how that gets built into the regular running of an organization in a hybrid environment or a full-time office environment. Knowing that piece of data just adds to this conversation.
Yeah, I think people will liken it to, okay, well, we have to get this every year. How is this any different than a flu shot? And you don't, mandate flu shots every year. But I think the difference here is that, at least from an employment perspective, the EEOC has provided guidance that COVID itself, not the flu, but COVID poses a direct threat to the workforce. And that's why the EEOC is saying, okay, this is not a medical examination. You can require employees, to quarantine, to get tested, to take their temperature, all of these things that the EEOC is kind of, pulling back from their policies about, because they've determined that COVID itself, does pose this direct threat. That could change. So over the years, if there's, herd immunity and a large portion of the population is vaccinated, the EEOC's determination of what constitutes a direct threat and whether COVID, constitutes a direct threat could change. So for the time being, I think employers can, fight that argument with respect to revaccination every year if people are likening it to the flu. But again, that could change, and there could be guidance down the road that says mandatory vaccination programs are no longer.
And to that question, Miriam, there's clearly a lot of interest in this topic. When a question was raised around, now this is a Pennsylvania, New Jersey related question, and you and I talked about this briefly the other day. Things like workers' comp and other laws, there might be more onerous responsibilities in one state versus another. As it relates to these issues, I'm assuming there probably isn't a lot of guidance right now because this is all unfolding, but workman's comp is something that has its own process and accountability and complexity. Anything to add to that, at least for today?
Not really, at least for today, because it is so state specific as to, whether you would be entitled to workers' comp for COVID exposure. And there are so many different facets that can go into, each individualized, episode and what happens to how the person contracted COVID and what the employer did or did not do. So, I think this is playing out. I think probably some states are going to amend their workers' compensation statutes to, perhaps, account for some of these concerns. But, for the purposes of today, there's really nothing more to say on that other than, this is really dictated by state. And some states will allow workers' comp recovery for exposure to COVID in the workplace.
So to bring us full circle, Eric, as just kind of as a takeaway for everybody this morning around the topic of space, reusage, redesign, what would you want everyone to know to finish up this session today?
Make a plan. I mean, it's such an opportune time to review your real estate. Landlords are very, very anxious to secure leases and are therefore more accommodative to the needs of tenants, especially. I mean, in New York City, it's been an absolute. The last 5 years or so for office space has been just absolutely brutal. But in the suburbs, it hasn't had that same tone. It's been much more conciliatory. So, make a plan. Let's figure out what it is that you want to accomplish, and this is the time to act. I can't emphasize that strongly enough.
Thanks, Eric. Miriam, you were great. Really appreciate all the expertise and help for today's session. And Chris has entered the room.
Hey,
so,
Steve, before you
Chris,
jump off that
you.
last question, I don't know if you can hear me. The last question that Nancy asked, I don't know if Miriam can see that, about Nexus and whether we have Nexus being created. I know that's a lot of CFOs are thinking about that. Anything you can help with there?
So in terms of whether you have employees that are working in a different state,
Right. Does
but
that create
staying
Nexus
remote?
from a state law
Is that
perspective? And I know you're not necessarily a tax person, but.
Oh, sure. I mean, from an employment perspective, it depends on where the employee is working. I can't really, speak to the tax perspective on that, but certainly if an employee is working in a state, regardless of whether it's remote, the state's employment laws could apply to that
Nancy
employee.
and all, we'll follow up with a couple of these. These are some great questions that are a bit technical in nature. We'll definitely take these down and send some notes to follow for this discussion.
So just one last thing, Chris. I posted something in the leadership Slack channel last week around return to work that could be an interesting resource. And I'm also going to plug into the chat now an open source page that I know someone who is gathering return to work information from other companies that could be helpful to people. So I'll share that in a moment.
As usual, Steve, excellent job. Eric and Miriam, we really thank you for your time here. And from the looks of the chat, it's on everyone's mind, as you said, Steve, can't be any more timely. So again, thanks all. We really appreciate it.